I have great pleasure supporting this bill.
Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Phil Goff.
Speaker, I've got a copy of this bill in my hand, and as the House will see, it's paper thin. It's one page, two-sided, one page. And I have to say, the SOP is the same length, and the SOP, I have to say, actually has more substance and will make more change than the bill itself. No, I want the member to listen to this, and then the National Party can reply if it has any reply, but I guarantee it doesn't. The Minister's speech at each stage of this bill has barely gone 3 minutes, and that is an indication that there isn't actually anything in the Minister's bill itself that will make a material difference in practice. Won't make a difference in practice. What actually makes this bill worthwhile is the SOP introduced by Charles Chauvel, my colleague, because it does extend the sort of attitude that an assault on a police officer or a prison officer, which is regarded by the courts as an aggravating factor, to other frontline personnel, emergency workers such as fire staff and medical staff. And I've got to say, Mr Speaker, I'm strongly in favour of that. When I spent a night into the early hours of the morning, or late into the morning actually, at Auckland Hospital, I was told by the doctors there that every Friday and every Saturday night our medical staff are subject to assault by drunken people. And that's maybe something this House should consider when we're looking at another piece of legislation, the Alcohol Reform Bill. So it is important to extend that sort of recognition to other people at the front line doing their job that Charles Chauvel's SOP actually does. But I want to come back to the regulatory impact statement. This is a statement, Mr Speaker, as you're aware, that is produced by the government's advisers, the Ministry of Justice. And what does that regulatory statement say? Well, first of all, it says that in certain circumstances, legislation explicitly sets out that an attack on police officers or prison officers is an aggravating factor. And for the worst offence, for example, the murder of a prison officer or a police officer, there is not any fuzzy statement that the court should take into account. It directs the court. It makes it mandatory that the life sentence for murder must begin with at least 17 years. And we put that legislation in, and it's justifiable. If anybody kills a police officer or a prison officer in the course of their duty, of course it's an aggravating factor, and it should be treated as such. Further, the Crimes Act makes specific reference to the use of firearms against an officer or an aggravated attack. But in the Sentencing Act, we did not explicitly include that police officers or prison officers, an attack on them should be regarded as an aggravating factor. Section 9(1) of the Sentencing Act 2002 does run a list of factors that the court must take into account, but it's not exhaustive. It doesn't specifically include an attack on police or prison officers. But Section 9(4) of the Sentencing Act covers that. It says that the court may take any other aggravating factor that it thinks fit into account. That's what it says under Section 9(4) of the Sentencing Act. And the Ministry of Justice, in its regulatory impact statement, says that because a factor is listed under 9(1 doesn't imply that it should be given any extra weight by the court. In fact, it says there is, and I'm quoting this, Mr Speaker, there is no impediment to the court regarding the fact that an offence is committed against a police officer or a prison officer as an aggravating factor under the current law. It says it explicitly. The court can regard that now as an aggravating factor. And not only can the court regard it as, common law shows that the court is doing that. It's doing it right now. 1985, the case of Crown and Tua, sets out something in the judgment of the High Court that I agree with completely. It described an attack on a police officer as, quote, an equivalent to an attack on the community, because our police are the representatives of the community in the matter of law and order in society. They are society's front line." End quote. So there you have, in a case 17 years ago, an explicit recognition by the High Court that any attack on a police officer or a prison officer should be regarded as an aggravating factor, and is regarded as an aggravating factor. So this bill does not change current practice. One has to ask why the minister brought a bill into the House that doesn't change what is already happening. The Court of Appeal has backed up the High Court in this. It's emphasised the gravity of using serious violence against the police, and it's upheld sentences that could be regarded as deterrent sentences. I worry about the use of that term, deterrent sentences, because as much as I've read of how sentences impact on criminal behaviour, I have not seen any evidence that the sentence acts as a deterrent. Time will prove, Mr. Speaker, that this piece of legislation brought in by the minister will not change the gravity of the sanctions imposed against offenders who attack police and prison officers, because that is already an aggravating factor. They are already doing it, Mr. Speaker. There's a whole lot more in the regulatory impact statement that makes the point time and again, that this bill will not change the practice. One wonders about a minister that brings in a bill complete with a regulatory impact statement from her own department that says it will make no difference. It talks about the limited nature of the proposal. It says that offending against law enforcement officers has long been taken into account as an aggravating factor in sentencing at common law. It says this bill does not and cannot direct the court to take specific action. So my challenge to the National Party is that in bringing this legislation in, where is there a skerrick of evidence in their own ministry's regulatory impact statement that says that this bill will make any difference in practice? I come back to the statement that I began with. The thing that will make a difference was actually the SOP that was moved by my colleague, because it is not a practice in common law to take into account that an attack on an emergency officer, a fire officer or a medical officer should be regarded as an aggravating factor. So that will actually make a difference. And I congratulate my colleague on that, and I acknowledge the good sense of the minister in adopting that SOP into her bill. I think she knows the bill was empty of any substance, and she grasped with great enthusiasm an SOP moved by a Labor MP that actually added a little bit of substance into the bill. I've got to say, Mr. Speaker, that whatever legislation that we pass, we've got to ask how much difference it will make. Is there a problem? Yes, there is a problem. The level of attacks on police and prison officers have been increasing in recent times, and that's something that should be of a concern to every member of this House. But I've got to say that if you're looking to make a difference, Mr. Speaker, the fact that the Labor government in its last term of office increased the police numbers by over 1,000, that actually made a difference. And how many extra police officers did the national government bring in its last 3 years, not including those that were funded in the 2008 budget? I'll tell you, it's a handful, just a handful. So if you're looking at a government that actually makes a difference in protecting the police and increasing their numbers, it's a Labor government that's done it. If you look at a government that respects the role of police officers and prison officers by giving them reasonable wage increases, it was a Labor government that did it. What this government has just introduced by way of a police salary increases doesn't even meet the level of inflation. What the Labor government did was bring in real legislation, the Sentencing Act, the Parole Act, the Proceeds of Crime Act, not superficial, frivolous, politically oriented legislation, which is what this government is about. I congratulate Charles Chauvel. I say we will support this bill, but there is not a member in the national government that can point to any evidence at all that what they have moved will make a skerrick of difference in sentencing practice.
I call Mark Mitchell.
Mr. Speaker, under Labor